Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, the 2020 update, forecasting supply and demand and anticipating regulatory compliance challenges. This webinar is brought to you by Green Ship Technology and Shipping 2030. My name is Lisa Kelsey and I will be your moderator today. In a moment, I will be turning things over to our speaker, but first let me explain how you can get the most out of this event. To improve your viewing and listening experience, you can move your webcast windows around by dragging on the title bar or resize them by clicking on the lower right corner. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find multiple application widgets. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the green resource list widget. We welcome questions about our topic and will answer as many as we can following the presentation, but feel free to submit yours to the queue at any time. Just type it into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen and hit the submit button. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. So now let me introduce today's speaker. We have Roger Strevens, who is the Global Head of Sustainability at Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics. You can find more information about our speakers by clicking on the speaker bio widget at the bottom of your screen. With that, let's get started. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sita, and good morning, everybody. This is a very big and interesting topic. I think that the industry has never been faced with a regulatory challenge before of this scale. And the picture that I've got in front of you here on the to begin with of these sea lines, I think it's a good metaphor for describing the state of the industry now. There are those players, the stakeholders, both on the shipping side and on the supply side, on the customer side, who are alert and ready, who are waiting, prepared for what's coming. And there are others, on the other hand, who are still soundly asleep. And I think that it is wise for all of us to consider which of these categories we find ourselves in. So moving straight into the presentation, we've got a situation here which is regulation, but a completely different kind to what we're used to. First of all, this will involve, for most vessels, a change in the fuel that the industry is running on. And that, of course, will have profound operational and technical consequences. It will also mean that there's a big change in OPEX coming, operating expenditure that is, because simply put, the fuel that the industry uses today is the cheapest available. There is a lot of uncertainty regarding what's coming next in terms of the compliance paths, no matter which of the paths in question we're talking about. And then as a first for environmental regulation of any kind, we have a commercial aspect, which stems again from the cost. And if all of that weren't enough, we have concerns around fair competition as well, which is something that's novel again with this regulation. So ultimately, what it really boils down to is that there's a combination of two things which really raise the stakes, and those are the uncertainty and the fact that all of this is going to cost a lot of money. So that in combination really is what should be driving attention to this challenge. When we look at it, there are, say, three major compliance routes. There are low sulfur fuels. There are then high sulfur fuels used in combination with a scrubber. And then there are LNG dual fuel solutions where LNG and MGO are being used in combination. In practice, though, there are going to be very few LNG types of vessels that aren't vessels using LNG, which aren't already LNG tankers. They will represent a tiny portion of the overall industry. And then of the remainder, there's also the vast majority of those vessels will be complying with low sulfur fuels. So if we look at a world fleet of over 50,000 vessels, we may have up to 2,500 or 3,000 scrubbers that will be installed by the 1st of January 2020, if everything goes very much to plan, and several hundred perhaps vessels that are have LNG solutions. So very much the emphasis here is on low sulfur fuels. And to a lot of people, it may seem that fuels are the easy compliance route, and I think that that's a view certainly which we would dispute. First, there's the cost aspect of it, and we're in crystal ball territory as far as cost goes. It's the same as trying to predict what the price of oil will be in a year and a half from now. Nobody can tell you that with confidence, and not least because the major product that will be used for compliance is very low sulfur fuel oil, less than 0.5% sulfur fuel. It currently doesn't exist, so we don't even have historical data to guide us. So cost is one aspect. Then there's the type of fuel, and there are products that will be used in 2020 which are very familiar to us already. MGO is a clear example of that. You could consider it as your standard friendly beer, but there will also be exotic cocktails or types of fuels that come to the market, and those are very low sulfur fuel oils. Better to think of them as a group of fuels with a common characteristic, that being less than 0.5% sulfur, rather than one specific type of product by itself. In addition to that, then we've got quantity issues to think about. Will you be able to get the sufficient supply of the product that you need in the next factor, the location where you want it? So it's all very well if you if what you can get is what you need is 300 tons, but all they've got available is 150 tons. Then we've got a compatibility issue, and that's where two batches of what's nominally the same fuel may or may not be mixable. And if they're not mixable, if they're not compatible, well, then you can get a waxy solid forming in your fuel tank, and basically there are very few options but to have to dig that out. So it's something to avoid. That problem can be reduced by keeping these separate batches of fuels separated from one another, and the possibility for doing that will vary according to how many fuel tanks there are in a vessel. So it's vessel design specific. We're into a topic which is pretty complex at this stage, and of course then the crew factor is incredibly important. So the emphasis on crew training is absolutely essential. And finally, we've got quality issues, which have been in the press quite a bit in the last while, and that's because the kinds of issues with fuels meeting the ISO standards for fuel, but yet at the same time being unusable, are expected to become more frequent as we get past 1st of January 2020. Now, all of these factors, of course, they're all related. And if you're having trouble with one of them, you might have trouble with your entire strategy on using fuels for compliance. It's going to be a difficult situation, and I think being prepared and spending time on the details and considering your bunker planning and arrangements very carefully is certainly going to put you in better stead than leaving everything until the last minute. So on the enforcement side, there's a couple of developments which I think are going to be quite influential here. One is on a new regulation which is probably going to be formally adopted next week. We should hope that it is. It's called the Carriage ban, and it's the Carriage ban on non-compliant fuel, is to give it its proper name. What it'll do is it'll prohibit having fuel of greater than 0.5% sulfur on board unless that vessel has a scrubber. If you think about it, there should be no reason for having that kind of fuel on a vessel post the implementation of this, which is March 2020. So like I say, this one is up for formal adoption at MEPC 73 next week, and it would have the effect of strengthening the hand of the enforcers, because they would no longer have to prove where fuel was being used. If they find above 0.5 fuel on a vessel, and that vessel doesn't have a scrubber, well then non-compliance is judged at that point. In addition, this is a solution this is a regulation which will work together nicely with remote sensing technologies, which have been used quite extensively in the ECA areas. These are the drone technologies and bridge sniffers, which can help fairly reliably determine vessels that are probably compliant from those which are probably not compliant. And so you can see then how these work pretty carefully, closely together. First, a vessel which may need a closer inspection is identified, and then very quickly you can, with an in-port inspection, you can determine whether fuel is above 0.5 is on the vessel, and then make a judgment on compliance. So this is going to be a powerful tool. There is a question, of course, which remains on whether it will be used, because tools are only effective really if they're put to use, and that part is not certain at this stage. What the enforcement arrangements of different flag states will be is quite hard to determine. Another issue which comes up in terms of fuel is FONARs, and that stands for Fuel Oil Non-Availability. Try that again, Fuel Oil Non-Availability Report. And in some circles, it has been suggested that these will be like a get out of jail free card. I think that would be a very big mistake to view it that way. One thing to be very clear about is this is a declaration by a vessel that it has tried best efforts to not being able to source compliant fuel. It is not a compliance exemption that's awarded by any authority. It is something which a port state can take into consideration when it considers the compliance scenario around a vessel. It is, of course, it would be operationally undesirable to load high sulfur fuels into a tank which had already been stripped and cleaned, because, of course, that cleaning process to remove residual 0.5 or higher high sulfur fuel is time consuming and rather expensive. And there is also the additional likelihood that surplus high sulfur fuel, in other words, fuel which is remains on board once a port vessel gets to report her compliant fuel is available, it is entirely likely that that fuel would have to be offloaded. And again, that's because of the carriage ban. So I think that ship-sized FONAR loopholes are pretty unlikely. So I think what really the sort of hopefully has been made clear is that for all compliance pads, and not least for fuels, we have a lot of factors that are unknown and which should be given careful consideration before really making choices and going forward. There is, to recap, there is the cost side of it. What will a fuel cost in 2020? That's an interesting question, but of course you could ask the same question for 2025 or 2035, because that isn't any less significant. Then there's the regulatory development aspect of this. Now, there are additional local sulfur regulations which are cropping up, but in addition to that, there is a very big regulatory development process around greenhouse gas that's underway, and it's interesting and important to consider what that regulation, what impact it might have on the compliance choices you make for sulfur. It's not easy to pick a strategy on this, but it's certainly important to consider. There's the technical feasibility of any of the Sulphur 2020 compliance pads, including fuels, is will they work for the kind of ship that I've got? If you change from one fuel type to another, you need to be sure that your lubrication regime is able to match with the new kinds of fuel, and that the machinery can cope with fuel of different temperatures or different viscosities. And then, of course, there's the supply side. Will you be able to get the fuel that you need in the sufficient quantities and locations necessary, not just in 2020, but much further out into the future as well? So all of these factors are manageable with the right level of focus and attention. So Sita, that takes us to the end of the presentation. I'll hand the word back to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Roger. Thank you very much. It's a very concise presentation. I always find that with 2020, it's a bit like Pandora's box. When you solve one problem, another crops up. So I'm pretty sure that there will be numerous conversations thereafter. We've had a few questions that have come in during the broadcast, so I'm going to ask them. If there are any that we don't get a chance to ask, then Roger will be able to answer them after the broadcast, and we will distribute as a download. So the first question I've got here for you, Roger, is around OPEX. How do you minimize the increase in OPEX in regards to into compliance?
I think the answer to that is to take a balanced approach to compliance for your fleet. And that starts with recognizing the importance of looking at vessel-specific compliance choices. If you try to take a one-size-fits-all approach, even if that was possible, and I'm not sure that it is, you will sub-optimize your compliance cost. And the best choices for a vessel will be governed by a range of factors. They include the age of the vessel, the type of vessel it is, or where it trades, availability of the cost of the different fuels where the vessel will operate, for example. And so once you've taken all of those into account, it's quite likely that you'll find that a variety of or a couple of different compliance paths are actually going to give you the best outcome. And certainly for our fleet, we found that it makes sense for us to have a combination of scrubbers on some vessels and to use compliant fuels 0.5 and marine gas oil for eco compliance at 0.1. That will be our approach.
Okay. I suppose maybe I should have asked this question first, but how much do you expect OPEX to rise?
That is like asking how long is a piece of string. It's of course it's connected to what the oil prices will be, and if you go to look at what the analysts are saying, you very quickly form the conclusion that they don't agree, and what they say varies over time anyway. But one thing we can, just to try and put in, add some points of fact to that general question is, today fuel differential is around $210, $215, $220. That's the differential between high sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil, 0.1% fuel. If you look at the futures market, it has a greater differential. That's the futures for January 1st, 2020. That ton, so the differential. However, there are quite a number of prominent oil industry analysts and some of the major commodities banks who believe that the futures market is mispricing both high sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil, and that it is possible we will see a differential around the 1st of January 2020 of up to $700 per ton. That's a differential between, again, high sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil. Now, yeah, of course, at that stage, I mean, we're talking about a range from anywhere for today, we're around $200 out to $700. I think what that really illustrates is that it's a very, very uncertain picture on what we should anticipate. And I might add another point to that, which is that I've just been talking about two of the three fuels which will be involved in the 2020 scenario. The one which is actually going to be most important from a compliance perspective is very low sulfur fuel oil, or 0.5% fuel. And there isn't any information on what that's going to cost yet, but it is likely it will be marginally discounted from 0.1% marine gas oil prices rather than marginally marked up from high sulfur fuel oil prices. And there is a formula which is used by some big banks and to give an indication of what that product might cost, and it's based on on a very simple formula, which is that if you take 5/6 of the cost of marine gas oil and you add 1/6 of the, I should say price rather than cost, and you take 1/6 of the price of high sulfur fuel oil, that will give you something which is probably in the region of what very low sulfur fuel oil will cost. And the formula is just based on the ratios of those two products that you would need to create a product which has 0.5% sulfur. So it's not scientific, but it may give you an indication of what to expect.
I suppose you've already answered this question in part, but I mean, in terms of, we focus so much on the practicalities of 2020 compliance and working with the as many different stakeholders in the right way. But in your opinion, how positive or negative have discussions been with fuel suppliers when it comes to, you know, meeting that 2020 deadline?
I think that our experience as Wallenius Wilhelmsen has been quite positive, and I think that the experience that a shipping company will have in dealing with the challenge around both fuel quality and fuel quantity will depend to quite a large extent on the size of that company, the size of the fleet that it operates, as well as the way that it operates its fleet. Now, we're a liner company, and that means that we know where our vessels are going to be weeks and months in advance. That in turn allows us to plan our bunkering far in advance. And because we can do that, it then helps us to consolidate our bunkering into fewer ports, which, combined with the fact that we do use a lot of bunker, makes us quite a large commerce that if you are a large repeating customer, a returning customer, well then it helps to move you to the front of the line, as it were, at the fuel pump. So that's and it also the same argument applies in terms of being able to access relatively good quality fuel. Now, what I'm not saying is that we think that this isn't going to be that we think this will be easy. We don't. We think that this can be a big challenge, but I think compared to some, we're not sailing for the eye of the storm, at least.
Okay. So, in your opinion, then, I mean, I don't know whether you're anticipating or you're experiencing it right now, but what would you say is the single biggest challenge when it comes to hitting that 2020 deadline for your fleet?
I think most aspects of the challenge are well under control. I think that it's having the managing the transition on the vessel is very 0.5% fuel 1 second sooner than you have to. So to get that transition absolutely on the stroke of midnight, that is, that's part of the art, almost, you could say, of running a fleet and running even down to, of course, the individual vessel level. So that's I think that's a very big challenge, and preparation is going to help in huge to huge degree on that. Of course, the commercial challenge with 2020 is critically important. I think ours as an industry, generally speaking, where we don't enjoy enormous margins, and so there is going to be a pass-through of cost, and that adds a new kind of dimension to sort of a regulatory challenge, something that we're not familiar with in this industry before. Normally, when there's regulation, you turn to the engineers, and there's a technical and operational decisions to be made. But this is something different, and how well we deal with that is will remain to be seen. But there's certainly no shortage of focus on it.
Okay, cool. Just a couple more questions before that they have. What do you think needs to happen with these regional authorities to ensure that the playing field is level and that there is an achievable goal in sight, which is kind of almost enabled a little bit by the regulatory parties in hand?
Right, and I think it's a very important question, this one as well, because of course, given that fuel is such a large part of the cost base and that we're in a very competitive industry, if you have some companies who are choosing to go with non-compliance and taking their chances, well then of course they will have a favorable cost position relative to all of the companies who are doing things the correct way. And so that's the level playing field scenario that you're talking about. Enforcement plays a critical role in ensuring that fair competition continues, and the preparations that basis, because this is something which is a sovereign matter. It is not IMO's responsibility to enforce this. It's at the individual state level. And of the roughly 90 countries who have got an obligation to enforce the 2020 carriage ban, there are only about 30 of them, the ECA countries, who have prior experience of this. And it is quite a technical subject. So there will be specially started an initiative called the Trident Alliance, which is a group of shipping companies who are in favor of robust, effective enforcement of these regulations. We did a study on this question, and some countries have got effective, proportionate, and dissuasive penalties, and that's to use the language used in the European Sulphur Directive, just as an example. But there are some who have penalties which are far, far smaller than the potential benefit that could be, or economic benefit that could be achieved from non-compliance. So there is anxiety on that. I think that the situation is certainly improving, and developments like the carriage ban will help strengthen the hand of the enforcement agencies. But like so much else in relation to Sulphur 2020, continued focus and an effort is still required.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Last couple of questions, and I suppose they're a little bit future facing. With current compliance solutions, for example, scrubbers, LNG, will they still be around in 2030 and 2050? By which point, the industry is looking towards decarbonisation.
Yeah, it's that is a great question, and I mean the importance of that question I think will become increasingly obvious as the next number of weeks pass by. As many may be familiar, that the IMO set a greenhouse gas reduction target of well, there's a number of them, but one of them was that there should be at least a 50% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions from shipping by 2050 relative to 2008. Now, if you look at that from the increase in you factor in the increase in the size of the world fleet you expect over that time, we're probably talking about a reduction on a per vessel basis of somewhere from 70 to 85%. And so that does raise questions on compliance choices for sulfur, because all of the compliance choices basically involve a little increase in CO2 and that's when you take a well to wake perspective, including on LNG, although that could be marginally lower, I suppose. But so that 2050 objective, that our target rather, that is going to be reached with the help of regulation that IMO is drafting right at the moment. There is as we speak, there is a session at IMO in London to help identify and then develop regulatory pathways to achieve that target. And so, although it seems like a far off challenge, it actually is deceptively urgent and current. And it's it adds to the dilemma for shipping companies. I think that if you maybe you could argue that with at least with staying with a liquid fuel solution, that you do then leave the door open for switching to biofuels or biodiesels, or at least fuels that have a component of biodiesel somewhere down the future, down the line. But it's something which is shrouded in a lot of uncertainty, but warrants paying a lot of attention to.
Okay. All right, last question, Roger. Obviously, we focused so much on that 2020 deadline, that 1st of Jan deadline. But I kind of suppose that a way to end this discussion, what kind of pressures do you think seafarers are going to face, post or come 2020? What's going to be, in your opinion, what's kind of the future of the new regulation or the new level of compliance that we have to face?
Well, I think among the challenges for crew in relation to 2020 is managing a more complex fuel situation than what's already the case. To give you an idea, that some of the 0.5 products require heating, others do not require heating, and so if you're going to heat a product that doesn't require heating, you're going to have a pretty serious safety problem. And that sort of is just one indication of how this will become more complex. What I described earlier with compatibility of fuels is expected to become a more significant issue post 2020 than it is now, and the same goes for fuel quality issues. All of those mean crew and that it's something which is operationally critical, and you can't overstress the importance of that point.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I think we've run out of time. Thank you as ever, Roger. As I said before, it's a very concise presentation that you delivered. 2020 is always, as you kind of rightly defined, an interesting but complex subject. So really appreciate that. I'd like to thank Roger for the presentation. And just as a reminder, any questions that haven't been answered through the broadcast, we will be following up with Roger afterwards, and he'll be happy to answer any further questions that we receive. Also, just to let you know, you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to view the recording of today's presentation. So if you found this event useful, please share it with your colleagues. We have also included the link to the Digital Week webinar series in the resource list widget. Please be sure to click on the link to register for other events in the series. Once you leave the event, a short survey will pop up in your browser window. We'd appreciate it if you could share your feedback on this event, as it helps us to provide you with content most interesting for you. So with that, once again, thank you to Roger. Thank you for listening, and on behalf of Connect 365 Maritime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.